Bright Duty. Every student matters.
Hello everyone. So let's start our new topic here where we are going to talk about the unit here talks about the path to modernization. So now students, this is our chapter number 12 where we are going to have a brief preview of what are the things that you are going to learn in the subsequent chapters. So in this chapter, we are going to have a brief introduction of all the things that we are going to learn in chapter number 13, 14, 15 and so on and so forth. Now students, when we are talking about the introduction part, it's always important to have a look at what you read in your previous chapters or the previous class here. So when we are talking about the previous class or previous chapters, you have learned about the medieval period or the nearly modern period where you learned that what were the modern developments or the changes that were taking place in that particular year or that particular time here, right? So in this chapter or in the subsequent chapters that we are going to learn forward, we are going to focus on the modern world. We are going to focus on the period or the events that took place thereafter, which has been described by historians as modernization. Now, what does the term this modernization mean? It means that somewhere we are talking about the developments that took place in all spheres. Whether it's the political sphere, whether it's economic, whether it's social, whether it's intellectual and so on, right? So in all these chapters, we are going to understand that how the world was moving into a transitional sphere or in a transitional phase. Transitional phase, what does it mean? We are going to see the transition that took place from the medieval to the modern period. So what were the new changes that were coming now when we are talking about the world here? So the first change that you're going to learn about is the Industrial Revolution, and later on you're also going to learn about the political revolutions that took place all over the world. In this part, you are mainly going to focus on the American Revolution, and then we are also going to focus on the French Revolution. So these are certain revolutions, these are certain political developments that took place. Now, why did it happen? How did it happen? And what was the phase, right, in which it happened? These are certain questions that we are going to answer in these chapters under the heading that is political revolutions that were taking place. Now, firstly, let us try to understand about the Industrial Revolution. Now, before this, have you ever learned about the Industrial Revolution? If I were going to ask you this question, that do you understand the meaning of the term Industrial Revolution? What are you going to say? Okay, it was some kind of violent action that took place in industries, something like this. You might think about that. No, students. Now, when we are talking about Industrial Revolution, you just need to understand that Industrial Revolution, it means that coming up of industries. Now, before this, you haven't read about industries, right? In medieval period or so, you haven't read about industries in general when we are talking about the ancient part or the medieval world. But it happened during this transitional phase, that is when we are talking about Britain. The first thing that you need to remember is that Industrial Revolution, it became popular or it was first introduced in Britain. Now, Industrial Revolution, what does it mean? It means that industries were being now built in different eras of Britain. And later on, we see that the concept of industrialization, it means that coming up of industries, it spread out to different parts of the world. So here in the first part, we will understand that what was the implication of Industrial Revolution, how did it help Britain, how did it bring about social economic development in that particular place, and how the idea of Industrial Revolution, it impacted the rest of the world. So here historians, they have their own different views on the Industrial Revolution here. So we see that some historians, they think that British industrialization, they served as a model for industrialization in other countries. Now, when we are talking about the British industrialization, when we are talking about the coming up of Industrial Revolution, it comes somewhere in mid-18th century here. Now, after that, we see that in other parts of the European countries, let's say when we are talking about Russia, when we are talking about France, when we are talking about Germany, we see that the Industrial Revolution somewhere, it hit this place or it came about in this period, that is 19th century. Somewhere after, it was happening in Britain. So, historians, they have their own views regarding the Industrial Revolution. So, we will try to understand the hypothesis here. We will try to understand that what were the statements given by the historians. So historians also have different views. We are reading history, students. We are the students of history. So definitely you are now aware that each and every historian, they have their own view. So there is nothing something called black and there is something called white. We always stay in the gray portion here, try to understand and challenge all the statements written by the historians, try to analyze those statements. So industrial revolution, when it came about here, when the industries were built up in Britain, certainly we see that there was an upgrade in the economic sphere or economic zone of Britain, and how it impacted the rest of the world. These are certain things that we'll try to understand. In our next chapter, we are going to talk about the impact of European settlers. Now, when we are talking about the European settlers, what do we see? We see that, you just need to have a look at the map here. Now, students, in modern period, when we are talking about the path to modernization, it did not happen all of a sudden. There was certain transitional phase that was happening side by side. Okay. So when we are talking about the European settlers, you know that it first hit in the region of Britain. So later on, what is happening? That all over Europe, we see that certain changes are taking place. Okay. Whether it's in the economic sphere, whether it's in the political sphere, or in the society as well. So here when we are talking about the European powers, everyone's aware that European powers such as the British Empire, when we are talking about the Spanish, when we are talking about the Dutch, when we are talking about the Portuguese, always relate to our country. You will remember all these important points. So here you know that all these European companies or the European powers, they came to India for the perspective of trading. Right? They came in the medieval period as well, and they tried to stay here in India. Now, it was only the British Empire that, became victorious after fighting all the other European powers here. So, when we are talking about the European settlers, we are talking about different powers such as Dutch, we are talking about Portuguese, we are talking about Spanish, we are talking about British Empire in general that became victorious among all the other European powers. So, the bourgeois mentality of the European settlers, what was that? The main idea or the main motive was trading. We are going to learn in detail in all these chapters. I'm just giving you a preview that what are certain things that you're going to understand here. So when we're talking about all these European settlers, we see that the main idea was to buy and sell everything. Whether it's land, whether it's water, whether it's some commodity that is being used on daily basis. They just wanted to sell and buy everything. This was the main idea here. Now the natives and the Europeans, they represented the competing notions of civilization. Now when you might have read about the India's struggle for independence in your junior classes. So somewhere you know that when we're talking about British Empire, they had this superiority complex in them, and whenever they made the colonies, they knew that they are trying to suppress the people, the natives of that particular place. So this idea, the complex of superiority and inferiority, somewhere it always clashed, right? So it happened with all the other colonies here. So the natives and the Europeans in general, the people who are the natives of the colonies and the Europeans who settled themselves there, they were competing, or they represented a competing notion of civilization here. Now here we see that the natives, they did not allow the Europeans to wipe out their culture. The main idea was to wipe out their culture and to establish their own culture in all these places. When we are talking about India also, in your junior classes you have read that how different reforms were brought about in our country under the British rule. So it is happening everywhere, whether we are talking about Canada, we are talking about Australia, we are talking about the parts of Africa. In all these places, that was the colony for the British Empire, right? So here we see that the natives, they were not allowing the Europeans that, you can take away our culture, you can wipe out our culture, and we are going to assemble ourselves in your culture, we are going to inculcate your culture. These are certain things that you need to understand. So when we are talking about the US, when we are talking about the Canadian governments of the mid-20th century, somewhere at first there was resistance, but later on we see that here also the government, they said that we should be joining the mainstream. Now what was the political idea or the development of the mainstream is not understood. We'll try to understand in the whole chapter. So these are certain things that you need to understand when we are talking about these chapters here. Now side by side you also need to understand that when we are talking about the regions of Japan, when we are talking about the parts of China, here also the concept of imperialism was there. We see that all these European powers, such as when we are talking about Russia, when we are talking about Britain, when we are talking about France, they were trying to, indulge America. They were trying to indulge in the political developments or the scenario of China as well. We are talking about Japan, where we see that imperialism was there, right? They also tried to establish colonies everywhere. So these are certain things that we'll try to understand the conflict and how the whole idea of colonization or imperialism was seen. When we're talking about chapter 15, here we'll see the path to modernization. So here we see that different societies, they have evolved their distinctive modernities. How? So we see that Japan, it remained free from the colonial control because imperialism was also here. They were also trying to establish colonies everywhere, and they made much more economic and industrial progress throughout the 20th century. Now you're also going to learn about the Second World War. Now time period, everyone is aware, I guess, right? So here when we are talking about the Second World War, this is something that everyone should be remembering, that when we are talking about the period 1939 to the period that is 1945 somewhere. So here we see that Japan was also participating in the war, but despite the fact that they lost in the war, we see that they made the economic progress much earlier than all the other countries that were involved in the war here. Okay, so these are certain things that we are going to understand in the part 2 modernization, taking the example of Japan. The next part that we are going to understand here is about China. So the Chinese, they resisted colonial exploitation by the imperialist power, right? So these are certain terms that we'll understand in detail. What does colonialism mean? What is imperialism? Do we have a blurred line between imperialism and colonialism? We'll try to understand that. They also struggled their own against their own bureaucratic landed elite. So landed elite we are talking about, it means that the upper class families here, right, who are holding all the lands. We will also talk about that how rebellions were taking place all over China, how the Communist Party, they were trying to rebel against the landed aristocracy, how they tried to build China into a one nation, one party state here after that, right? So we will see that how whenever we are talking about any the term colonization, imperialism, you always tend to hear about rebellions taking place by or being joined by the common people. So these are certain things that you cannot miss in these chapters here. So this is a short preview of what we are going to learn in the subsequent chapters later on. I hope that it has helped you to build a concept here that, okay, I'm prepared to learn all these concepts here and will try to excel in all these chapters.